how not to fail at food dehydrating. Hi, I'm Darcy from the Purposeful Pantry, and today I want to share about 10 tips with you about how not to fail at food dehydrating. So let's get started. Number one tip I have is you're going to fail. Just get to know that up front and you're going to do much, much better. Part of the thing that happens with food dehydrating is that things can change, or you forget a step, or you forget to turn on a dehydrator when you had turned it off and then you forgot to turn it back on, like what's happening right now with my pumpkin project. I forgot to turn it back on. And so I was expecting when I got up this morning, I would be able to get started right with the next step of a video I'm working on for you to restore my pumpkin powder for a year. But it's like one of those things is that sometimes you're just going to fail and it's okay. And just embrace that up front and you will have less stress about your projects later. Now, yes, failure does mean that you might waste food and you've wasted electricity, but what you can look at that being also is a teaching opportunity to help you the next time to do better and to be able to store more. Another tip I have is do your research. Doing the research about how you should do your project will help you in the long run not fail miserably, because you might learn the proper way to prepare your food, what kind of food you should use, what temperatures you should use. All those kind of things will play into making a project work better, and that you can learn what to do ahead of time so that you don't just jump right into something and then realize I did it all wrong and now I've wasted everything. People will get their machine, they will just slice a bunch of potatoes, they will put them on their machine and then not realize that I should have done something with these first, because why did they turn dark? Sometimes a blackish gray color that is really awful. And if they just done a little research up front, they would have found they needed to pre-treat their potatoes by blanching or soaking. And that would have saved them a lot of heartache in the end to find these things that they don't want to use. Not that the flavors change, but they just look really gross and they don't want to use them. Berries also. Many people will put berries onto their dehydrator trays, come back 3 days later and say, they're still not even remotely dry. What did I do wrong? You needed to break the skin. And if you had just researched it ahead of time to know that somehow you needed to do one of the things to break the skin, it would have been a much more successful dehydrating project for them. So they can go back and fix that one. They go back and just break the skin, do some quick pokes or slice through it, and they'll know, okay, this will dry and I'll be fine. Another way to be really successful at your dehydrating project is to think more about how you're going to use them later. Will help you know how to prepare them now. Tomatoes are often one of those things that people will come to me and say, how do I dry a tomato? And then I'll always say, how do you plan on using it later? That will affect how you dry the things more efficiently to know what you plan on doing with them in the long term. Now, granted, when you're beginning, you may not know what you're going to do with them or how to use them. So think about how you use fresh ones now. If the only way that you ever eat tomatoes fresh is on a salad, dehydrating might not be what you want to do to preserve them, because they will not have that same consistency. But if you use them in a sauce in dices a lot, or if you want to crumble them on a salad to have a kind of crunchy thing, or maybe even on a pizza, then you can do slices or dices. If you always plan on just using them for sauce, you can actually puree them, then dehydrate them and make a powder, and that will always make a sauce for you later easily by just blending it with some water to the thickness that you like. Or if you always just use tomato paste, then you can do the same kind of thing. So thinking about how you use it, how tomatoes in real life will affect and make your successful projects better when you're drying them. The next thing I want to stress to you is not to stress over tools. What you'll find is when you get on YouTube or you look on a website, you'll see people using fancy equipment for things that you don't have the money for. So you might see somebody using a meat slicer to slice their vegetables or fruits. You might see somebody using a big, huge machine that you simply don't have the money for. Or you might find some containers like jars here that you don't have access to. So don't stress over the tools. As long as you have a knife, as long as you have some way to dry, whether you're going to do air drying for herbs, whether you have a solar dehydrator that you made, whether you air dry in an environment that is good for that. Like my environment would not be good for that. It's too humid, too many bugs, and it's not a great place to air dry. But you may live in an environment where it's okay to do that. Whether you have a small one temperature machine, it's fine. Use what you have. You don't need big fancy equipment. Just do the process right and you're going to be. Another recommendation I have to help you be more successful later is to be not be quite so rigid in this is what the book told me to do, but some of that comes with experience. And so I just want to give you an encouragement now. If the book says dry something at 125 degrees, there is no safety issue for you to dry that a little higher or much lower. Okay, that temperature is the recommendation for the optimal drying time to keep the most nutrients and drying the fastest. So, but that doesn't mean it's going to be unsafe for you to decide, I don't want to do it at 125F, which is 52C. I would rather dry it and keep it raw. I want to keep all the nutrients and all the benefits of that food. So you might want to dry it. And sorry that I'm looking, sometimes I don't remember the C conversions as well. And I have this handy little magnet, which is also, you can also do a sticker version of this, which has the time and temperature recommendations in Fahrenheit and Celsius. But anything below 115F and 46C will keep things in the raw zone, which means that you've kept all the nutrient benefits, that you might have kept all the good bacteria and the good biologicals for things that are like fermented, like sourdough starter, and maybe fermented food that you want to keep dried, but you don't want to lose a good beneficial bacteria that are inside. So adjusting the temperature on almost everything is fine to adjust. So you don't have to be quite so rigid. The only thing that I am rigid about for as far as temperature goes is for meats and eggs. They need to be kept at those higher temperatures that are recommended to keep them safe. Learn the right way to do things, the recommended ways to do things, and then you can make those choices for yourself in your own home. Now, another tip I have for you is to properly prepare the food before you dehydrate it. Those recommendations on websites and books and what you might find online on YouTube or in a Facebook group, those recommendations are given because that's how it's been found to be the most successful way to do the food. So the thing that I want to also stress here is that you may find a recommendation on this website different than the one on this website, or you might find people doing things differently in a Facebook group than what you read online. That's one of those rigidity things that you can learn how to go with the flow, that people have found different ways to do things. You're not going to ruin your food as long as you're following safe food handling. Properly preparing things means that you are getting things ready to go into your dehydrator that are recommended because they've found that this is the best way to do it. So like we talked about earlier, doing blanching potatoes ahead of time will make it to where your potatoes don't turn dark. Now, there are some foods that are recommended to be blanched that you might not want to blanch. Celery is one that it is recommended to blanch celery before you use it because it softens the food, it helps protect the color, and when you rehydrate it, it's going to be a softer kind of mouthfeel. Now, some people go, I don't want to bother doing blanching with celery because I'm fine with the way it tastes at the end. And that's fine because it's not a safety issue. It's a little bit of a storage issue because it can preserve the color, that it doesn't turn white over time because it loses the color, but it's a texture issue at the end that doesn't matter. But properly doing those things that really matter, then yeah, know ahead of time that you need to do it, and you will have a more successful dehydrating project than if you don't follow those recommendations. Now, the next thing I'm going to recommend is to use a liner on your machine. Your machine may not even talk about liners, but liners help stop a couple of things. It makes things a little cleaner. It makes things not shrink. When they shrink and fall through the grids on your dehydrator, a liner can help stop that. It doesn't mean that your food is bad because it touches the bottom of your machine. It just may make things easier on you for cleanup. It stops things from sticking to the grids because some of those grids, stuff sticks to them hard. And like with the stainless steel grids, that stuff is hard to clean when things get really stuck on them. So use liners. Now, what you may want to use, I've got a couple options for you. Your machine may come with a liner and it may not at all. Some only come with one, some come with enough. But if you need to buy some, I've got an Amazon store set up that has just liners so that you can kind of browse through what might work for you best to see what the options are and to find the ones that work for your machine. I kind of did it because people often will come to me and say, I don't know what kind of liner to use. So I kind of made that resource to make it easier. But you can use a mesh liner like this, which may be a plastic, a little bit more rigid plastic, or it may be silicone where it's really flimsy. Either will work fine. You can get some of these packages really inexpensively on Amazon or eBay. So this will stop things that when you're drying and things shrink up, like a lot of cut vegetables will shrink up really small and they will fall through your grid. This will stop it from falling through. This also makes it really convenient to pull things up off of your liner, off of your trays, and dump it into your jar or onto a bigger surface that you're going to do something with later. So this makes things so much easier. Even if I don't need these, I use them, because just that fact of picking things up off of your dehydrator tray to put them elsewhere, that's what makes these great, because they bend, they can be funnels. So I use these all the time. You might also use something that is like a fruit leather sheet. So they can be made out of Teflon coated pieces. They can be all silicone. They can have a silicone lining on them. So fruit leather sheets can also be like a silicone tray that has a lip around the edge of it that you can put liquids into, or fruit leathers to make it easier. What you would use these for is to keep fruits from sticking to your trays. You can put puree on here to make fruit leathers. You may just like the fact that this is just even better than a mesh for keeping things from falling through and to collect easier. So these are handy, and I would recommend having both. Over time, when you can afford it, the packages for either of these run less than $20 for 6 to 10 sheets. So they're not really expensive, but they come in handy, and they are reusable so many times that you're not trashing things. You can also use something that looks a lot like this, which is parchment or baking paper, depending on where you are in the world, and it works the same way. It forms a barrier, it keeps things from sticking, it makes collection easier to pour into things. The problem with parchment paper is that it is disposable, so you can only use it a few times and you have to toss it. And on things that are purees that are really sticky or really wet, or if you're putting tomato slices down or some things like that, the parchment can actually start soaking up that liquid. It's meant for doing cookies and doing things in your oven, so it's not necessarily made for a lot of liquid. So sometimes things stick to parchment when it's not supposed to, which is the one reason why I don't recommend parchment as the majority of thing that you use. So another tip I have for you is do not use the timer on your machine as an indication of when your food is done. When a website, a book, a person on the internet tells you, it took me 6 hours to dry bananas, run very far. Now, of course, their bananas may have dried in 6 hours. I can't tell you the truth about that. But what happens is that people rely on time, and don't rely on time. The timer on your machine, or even your phone or your kitchen timer, should be used as a time to remind you to check the food, not as the indicator of that your food is done. Use it as a tool to help remember. Don't use it as a tool to say it's done. Another tip I have for you, especially when you're beginning, is to condition your food. This is not something that's taught with most food dehydrating courses or websites, but it's something that will help you be more successful at good food storage that doesn't go moldy if you do this tip, especially when you're beginning and you don't have some good knowledge about when things are actually dry. So what conditioning is that you've dried your food, you've allowed it to cool for 5 or 10 minutes, you've tested it, and you think it's all done. And that's great. So then what you do is you put it in a jar. And for 5 days to 7 days, depending on what your food is and the comfort level you have of the quality of what it's done, is you're going to shake it up once a day. Okay, you only really need to do it once a day. Some people will like turn it this way one day, and then the next day they turn it this way to remember how to do it. I just go through and shake it, and I'm done. That's all you have to do. And what you're looking for are indications of humidity in your jar that may mean that it needs to go back into your dehydrator. What you're looking for first is when you turn it over and you see things stick to the top. If they're sticking here and you shake it gently and it does not come off, likely it needs to go back in the dehydrator and dry some more. If you're seeing food clumps on the inside that are sticking together, even when you move it around, you see clumping happen, that needs to have longer drying time. If you see moisture that shows up along the top of your jar, it needs to have more drying time. If you see things stick to the edge and they're smaller pieces that are flakes or powders or something, and they're still sticking, but you're like, I don't know if that's really moist or not, likely that's really just static, because static can make things stick to glass. If you're finding something that sticks to the top and it doesn't shake off easily, After a try or two, put it back in. But maybe after one shake it comes off. Likely that's just compaction, which is just the weight of the food on the bottom part of the food, and sometimes it can happen with fruit because the sugars will cause it to stick. It's fine. If it comes off, you're good. What you're really looking for is things not coming off easily, or if they're clumping up a lot, or the moisture that you might see around the top. Those are things that indicate putting it back into the dehydrator and letting it dry longer. Now, the thing that I need to caution you about is if you see mold, you have to toss everything in the jar, because mold growing in this place means it's likely also growing here that you can't see it yet, and you just don't want to ingest that. Now, a difference between what you might see is you might see some foods, like right here, you might see, I don't know if you can because I can't get, you can see the white parts on the carrot. That's actually the carbs in the carrot, the sugars that are turning white after storage, after they've been on the shelf for a while. That's fine. If you rub on that, it will not come off. Mold, you will get it to, you will rub it off. So that's how you can tell the difference between those two things. So as long as you're conditioning food before you put it away on your shelf to store, that will give you a better indication, a better success rate to make sure that you're getting your food dried properly. Now, another tip is to store your food properly, because that will also lend to mold or food's going really soft or getting weird colors or whatever. Having food that is protected from light, heat, oxygen, and moisture are the things you need to do. Now, of course, you're going to see me storing my food right here where they're getting light, because I have no other place to store it. Practicality has to play into it. So I know that these foods will not last as long as foods that are stored in a cool, dark, dry place. But I just have no other options. I do not want to put a covering on this because it is a focal point in my kitchen. I like seeing it. For me, this is just more practical, and I go through this stuff so I don't have to worry about the implications of not storing it properly. The long-term storage, if you're wanting it for 2 or plus years, you need to have it in a cool, dark, dry place to get the best storage. Also, you want it in an airtight container. Having it in food containers that are not airtight, which means that air can exchange. It doesn't mean that there's no oxygen in here. It doesn't mean that you've taken all the air out. It means that you cannot have exchange between the outer atmosphere and the inner atmosphere, introducing new moisture and things like that. You want to have airtight containers, whether it's a canning jar, whether it's Mylar bags, whether it's a food saver bag, vacuum seal bag, whether it's a hard rigid plastic with a good clamping top so that it has an airtight seal, or whether it's a commercial jar that you find that's airtight. Use airtight containment. If you have it in flimsy plastic bags, they're going to reabsorb heat. They're going to reabsorb light and moisture, because, try that again, they're going to reabsorb moisture and air, because those things are not airtight. They're air permeable, which means air can come in and out of them easily, which is why you get freezer burn in a freezer, because you didn't get all of the air out ahead of time, and over time they just allow air movement through there. So if you need a reference about what makes good airtight containers, I'm going to have it down in the description box below and up in the iCards where you can go, and I have a list of things that will work well for airtight storage. So it doesn't always have to be a canning jar, because these are not readily available all over the world, and that's fine. Okay, another tip that I'm going to give you that is probably the best tip that I can. Give things time to dry. Earlier we talked about not using a timer as anything more than a tool to check things. But even if you're using a timer out, okay, even if you're setting it out 24 hours, just think about the fact that things need time to dry. My motto is, it's dry when it's dry and not a minute sooner. And even between batches, you're going to find that they just take different times. Be flexible about the fact that time is relative with dehydrating. So that means that what takes time to dry in my machine is not going to be what takes time to dry in your machine. And even from one batch to the next, you'll find that times vary. I like to have a little journal where I keep time, where I keep records about what project took this amount of time, and then it might change the next time, and I can think about what made those times change. Maybe it was raining like crazy like it is today, making my pumpkin project in my dehydrator now go much longer than if it was on a non-rainy day. And so time is just so relative. Give food time to dry. You cannot over dry most foods. Beef jerkies, And fruit leathers, they can be over dried and you might not like the way they turn out. But for the most part, if you're going to store it, you can't over dry it. So give things time. That's the biggest tip that I can give, because that is the biggest fail that I see across the board, is that people pull food too soon because they saw it someplace that it should only take this much time, or they didn't know the proper signs of dryness. They took it out too soon, things molded, and they wasted all that effort and all that money on things that didn't have enough time to dry. So if you would like to find more tips on dehydrating, you can look at this video right here and I will give you some more tips. And until I see you again next time, happy dehydrating. Thanks for being here.